morning, class, or afternoon, whenever you're viewing this, middle of the night, who knows. Today we are going to talk on chapter 10. And so I'm going to share my screen here and get us started. So chapter 10 is all about self-esteem and children's development of that, which is a really critical part of development for not only children, but even as us adults and moving through our life. We are going to relate it a lot to some of the other models that we have already been talking about. So Bronfenbrenner's bioecological model, even thinking about Vygotsky and how teachers can help support scaffolding and learning, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We're going to kind of go through those and relate it back to supporting self-esteem. If we understand how self-esteem works, then that helps us guide parents when we either observe ways in which they might not be supporting their child's self-esteem, or when parents come to us with concerns or questions, we can help relate them back to some of these principles. Okay, so if you'll think back all the way to chapter 1, you guys filled out your own bioecological model, but we're going to just take a quick little review of this and think about how this relates to self-esteem development. So obviously, the microsystem being one of the most, it is the most influential system in a child's life, the majority of self-esteem is going to come from the interactions within that system. However, I will suggest that sometimes when you're so close to some people in your family, emotionally, within proximity, you can't always hear the positive benefits that you possess in terms of a child can't always hear that from the microsystem. I think to my own kids when I talk about being proud of them, or when I notice a skill that I see developing in them and I want to compliment them, sometimes I get an eye roll. Like, Mom, they've even said, well, you have to say that. You're my mom. Which is completely not true. We know there are moms in this world that don't actually do that. So I think sometimes it's hard for children to hear, from their own family, or they think it's like a duty that I have to compliment them. And so they don't always hear that from the microsystem. And that's what's so important about having all these other layers in a child's life, because a lot of times children are going to hear from other people at the school, or, at a church, or just other, family relationships where a child might overhear another parent talking about their kids. And not that comparisons should happen, but they do. And sometimes that can help boost a child's self-esteem. The exosystem, we see how this can affect self-esteem greatly, whether it's extended family networks, but also the media having a huge effect on children's self-esteem, and typically not for a positive benefit, right? There's so much comparison that goes on in the media. That's why if you don't have that strong family base in your microsystem and in your mesosystem, those being, more primary heavy influences, children are more likely to believe even more about what they see in the media, that, beauty looks a certain way, that health looks a certain way, that success looks a certain way. And that all can affect and shape self-esteem, not only, even more detrimental if it starts really at a young age, but also, adults fall prey to this all the time. And especially if you've seen The Social Dilemma, you'll know that some of these things that are part social media and built into social media started out for what they thought were innocent, positive reasons, like, ooh, let's give people likes and make them feel good about themselves. And then what we did in our distorted way was start to say, well, but I need more likes than this person, or I didn't get as many likes as I wish I had. And that actually has had very detrimental effects, especially for teenage girls. The rate of depression and suicide is climbing very quickly. I can tell you from personal experience that every time I work in the emergency room, there are children there with some sort of mental health crisis. Every single shift, multiple children. And it's just really devastating. And then lastly, the macro system, being part of a culture, having values that are passed on. These things all help to create a child's self-esteem as well, because as we'll get into some of the dimensions of self-esteem, that's where you as a person connect to doing greater good. And so that's where some of that, one of the dimensions is virtue, and that's where some of that will come about. So we'll get into our dimensions of self-esteem here. So your book talks about 4 different dimensions. Significance is the first one. And this is really, feeling loved and cared about, feeling that you matter to someone. This is going to be primarily something that we should be getting from our microsystem. If we have a healthy family, a normal, healthy family, normal families have faults and issues, but nonetheless, there should be a general consensus that you love each other, that you care about each other, that you are there for each other, and that you matter to that person. So that even goes back to attachment and having that attachment figure. Then another dimension of self-esteem is competence, and that's where you're feeling capable, you're feeling skillful, you have a sense of accomplishment. We can see how children can gain that even maybe more so from their mesosystem, when they're involved in school, when they're involved in sports groups, other outside extracurricular activities. That would be part of the mesosystem, and that is where a lot of times children start to develop that sense of competence. All of these, to some degree, are developed over time and over the lifetime. But as we'll look at Erikson's psychosocial development, we'll see where there's different times in childhood specific to some of these different dimensions. Competence really budding in that last stage, kind of the industry versus inferiority stage, where children, are hitting like first grade through kind of that preteen years. This is where they start to develop that mostly. Also having a sense of power, and that means personal power. So feeling like you have the ability to have control over who you are, who you're becoming. You feel like you can affect people and the events in your life. Things aren't just happening to you all the time. And this really starts early on, because we have to remember as adults that we need to help children gain some of that personal power back, that we're not just there to tell them what to do, when to do it, how to do it, but let them make some of those decisions. And that comes early, when that toddler wants to try to dress themselves. There's those little moments, even in early childhood, where some of this is beginning to bud. And if we squash it all throughout that time, the child's going to give up trying to assume their own personal power. And I feel like that then can lead to, a mindset where that child could be more easily a target of bullying, or allowing, noticing that there's a right or wrong and not feeling like they have control over that outcome. And so we really need to, think about how we can encourage children's personal power early on, not in a way that means they get to do whatever they want. Don't hear me saying that. There are rules and boundaries, of course, but choice. We talked about choice earlier in some of our discussions and in some of our earlier chapters on how to help children feel more in control. And that feeling of control leads to the development of personal power. And then the last dimension is virtue. So feeling like you're being good, and that's according to your own standards. So this is not the same as an adult thinking you're good or someone else thinking you're good. This is that you think you're good on the inside. A child that's good in our society is typically quiet, is typically obedient, is typically does, what their parents say. And as the adult, we like that, right? That makes us feel like we've done a good job. But I would suggest that that's not the same as this. And that if we just have a child that is submissive all the time, they don't have a sense of personal power. They're not going to feel competent because they're not really doing anything on their own. They're just being told what to do all the time. And they're not going to develop a sense of virtue if they need somebody else to direct them constantly. And so we have to help children learn how to make choices, but we also have to recognize that when they do something that's maybe different than what we wanted in that moment, is this a sign of a higher attribute that even in this moment might make me as an adult uncomfortable? The only example that's coming to my mind right now is like when I hear my kids kind of bossing each other around. That feels really foreign to me because I grew up as an only child. But that is like an everyday common thing that happens in our household with 3 kids. And so when I hear them doing that, there is this uncomfortableness that I feel that I want to tell them, like, oh, stop, you should just be nice and just be quiet and, don't talk to people like that. And of course there's a line that can be crossed, and they do frequently. But I also think that there's times where they are really involved in play and they are directing the outcome of the play. And it's okay to kind of assume a leadership stance or assume a stance where they say, I don't want to do that. And they can tell their siblings that, and they have the power to do that. So there's personal power there, but there's also this ability that they get to make their own choices, which I think ultimately leads to virtue at some point in their life when they're deciding, do I want to be good to my own standards and morals, or do I want to just cave and do what the rest of the world says? And they need to have a voice in order to do that. And I think there's times where we try to squelch that voice and we don't allow them the opportunity to develop the ultimate dimension of virtue. And to me, there seems to be a little bit of a progression with these dimensions. And I don't know if your book, I can't remember if your book suggests that or not, but I think that if you don't have significance, it's hard to feel competent. If you don't feel competent, it's hard to gain personal power. And without personal power, you're likely to not gain virtue. Okay, these 4 dimensions are also part of your discussion this week. And there's a couple of video clips that you're going to be watching. And then I want you to share, and there's not really a right or wrong answer. I think you can make a case for any of these dimensions, but I want you to share what you think the child in these video clips really gains by the end of the video when it comes to these dimensions. If you can't choose, then describe the 2 that you think are really the priority. But yeah, think about these dimensions, think about what they mean to you based off of your text as well, and then watch those video clips. And then when you respond, like I said, there isn't necessarily a right or wrong answer, but I want you to respond with a lot of thought. I want you to tell me what you're thinking, why you think it is. Use these words, these dimensions of self-esteem. Actually use the words, use the definitions, give examples from the video that tell me why you've chosen that that dimension as what you think that child is gaining in the video. Okay. All right. Moving on. When we think about back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, I'm still not sure if I'm saying that right. I really need to listen to an audio of it and practice. We see that self-esteem is pretty high up on this hierarchy, right? And so while some children have the bottom three very early on in life, some children don't. So the basic physiological needs always have to be met before a child can progress anywhere. Then they need to feel safe, and then they need to have that love and belonging. Once that has been established, right? So the idea of attachment, then that's when children can start to work on self-esteem. So maybe that first dimension, significance, comes into play. And as long as these three layers underneath are supporting that child, then they can continue to work through their different dimensions of self-esteem until hopefully as adults at some point, we are working on self-actualization, which is the rest of our lifelong, a lifelong process for us. Okay, I want to talk briefly about competence. I use this example in another class, but I think of competence as something that is really budding in early childhood. And since most of us are thinking about working with early childhood education, wanted to kind of extrapolate a little bit on this one. So competence here, really, I think about it in terms of how we help young children develop. And so I use this example of a toddler and how he's starting to build a tower and he looks pretty proud of himself, right? And so you can imagine, though, that if an adult were to come over and say, you know, your tower looks kind of crooked, bud. Like, are you actually able to stack blocks, or is that really not something you can do? What's happening here? Like, it's gonna fall over one or two more blocks because you really haven't made this stable or secure at all. Do you have any skills, right? Or if we have this expectation that a child would build a skyscraper, right? I know this is a really extreme stretch and really extreme example, but competence comes for children when we have realistic expectations as adults. So if we expect them to do things that they are developmentally, and that could mean cognitively, physically, their language development, whatever, it could socially, if they're not capable of handling the expectation that we have, this squelches their competence, which squelches their self-esteem. So if we have this expectation that this little guy should be building something amazing, like a skyscraper out of his blocks, and then we put him down for just stacking 5 or 6 in a row, is he gonna come back and wanna do blocks? No. Is he gonna wanna come and seek help from us or seek guidance? No, right? We have to have realistic expectations in order to build competence. And this is one of the founding dimensions of young childhood. Move to our last slide here, Erikson's stages of psychosocial development. We've seen this a lot. We look at the different ages, and then we see the tasks that they each go through during that time period. But now we look here at the virtue that's developed. And so even though there's a little bit of a progression, I think, to those dimensions, there's also a progression within each dimension during the different ages of young childhood. So if we think about infants, what their task is during this period, it's trust versus mistrust, right? That kind of goes along with significance. Am I loved? Am I cared for? If a child develops trust during that time, then they can develop hope. But if a child doesn't develop trust, right, if they start to mistrust the world, that will not lead to hope, right? And so these psychosocial tasks are very critical in terms of how that virtue is developed. For the toddlerhood time, autonomy versus shame and doubt. If a child feels autonomous, they have a will, right? They've got motivation. If they just feel shame and doubt, there's no motivation there, right? Same. I mean, it goes on the same way. The preschool years, initiative versus guilt. If you feel guilt, or if you're made to feel guilt, and that's your outcome during this time, you are not going to feel purposeful. But if you have initiative, if you feel like, yes, I can take this on, you're going to develop a sense of purpose, right? And then during the school years, industry versus inferiority. This is where children that feel industrious lead to competency. But if you feel inferior, if you feel like you can't ever do anything right, you certainly won't feel competent. And so it's our job as adults in these children's lives to make sure that we are treating them in a way that helps to build their self-esteem. And again, that comes from realistic expectations of what they can do at different developmental levels, giving them a sense of significance, a sense of competence, of personal power and virtue, and helping them develop those characteristics early on in little ways so that as adults, they are secure in their self-esteem so that they can move on to that last part of the hierarchy, which is self-actualization. If you have any questions about this, don't hesitate to reach out. And I hope that you enjoy your discussion this week. Thanks.